Inequality isn't diminishing, it's getting worse. I spoke to Jason Hickel. He's an economic anthropologist whose research focuses on global inequality and political ecology. Also, I've noticed a lot of heavily pregnant cats around. Is that getting worse as well? In this conversation on my podcast, Under the Skin, which is available from Luminary podcasts on Apple, you can subscribe. There's a link in the description. We talk about the nature of inequality, the inefficiency of our current systems, and what will be required to change it. How can an ongoing narrative be the depletion of poverty when, e.g., 1 billion people are living on less than $1 a day? And the one that sort of always clumps me in the face when I read it, the richest 8 people in the world control the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population.
Yeah, it's a killer fact. It's horrible. So I want to go to the poverty number that you just mentioned. So, and that sounds bad enough.
Of course you do. I know the system now.
That's, the World Bank and the UN are telling us that the number of poor people in the world is between 700 million and 1 billion people, basically, right now. And what they've been saying is that number has been decreasing over the past 15 or so years because of the good things that they're doing, basically, through aid and so on. But if you look at how they measure poverty, there's a real problem at stake. That number comes from a poverty line. That's $1.25 per day, right? Now, scholars from all over the world have been pointing out that nobody can live on $1.25 a day. It's a totally ludicrous, immoral number. So in order to achieve the most basic levels of human subsistence, to achieve normal human life expectancy, to have a decent chance of surviving past your 5th birthday, et cetera, you have to have at least $5 per day, right? As like a moral minimum. They call this the ethical poverty line.
Can we just get below that moral minimum? I suppose so.
Exactly. So here's the thing: if you measure global poverty at that level, then it's not 1 billion people in poverty. It's 4.3 billion people in poverty, which is 60% of the world's population. And the number has been getting bigger over time, not getting smaller. And so again, I think that the narrative that we have that comes out of some of these bodies that don't worry, poverty is diminishing, inequality is diminishing, is just not true. And if you look at the scholarship behind it, we see exactly the opposite story. And so we really have to ask ourselves, why is the global economy so fundamentally flawed? To fix this problem, to make it fairer, is going to require more than just tweaking around the edges with a bit of aid here and there, but rather fundamentally reorganizing the system.
How on earth will we fundamentally reorganize a system when the system is clearly beneficial to the people that control it?
That's a good question. So I guess you can think about it this way, in terms of, is this possible or not? So I have lots of students, and a lot of my students come in deeply concerned about poverty and inequality and so on, and they get really interested in solutions like microfinance or foreign aid or whatever it might be. But the problem is that the solutions that they're interested in don't actually target the real structural causes of the problems that they are so concerned to address. Yes. If we can get messages out to these students who fill the development industry and all the development organizations that are out there that are trying to tackle these problems, that what we need is to tackle the real deep structual drivers, the actual causes of the problem in the first place, then the problem can be solved relatively quickly.
Go on.
So I mentioned one of the top solutions for me would be democracy in the institutions of global governance. So, and there are all sorts of proposals out there. I mean, this is a demand that global South countries have been making for a long time for fair representation.
It's weird because I never hear those arguments. So, like for ages, they've been going, "Can we have a bit of democracy in these world governance organisations?" And that message just never gets heard.
Never gets heard. Yeah, so, I think that there's all sorts of other interesting ones. Like, for example, there's a huge wage differential between workers in the global north and workers in the global south. And a lot of that is due to the fact that multinational companies can move around the world looking for the cheapest possible labor, but workers can't move across borders as freely, right?
Absolutely not.
Which is horrible. So what that means is that workers end up having to try to compete with each other to drive their own wages down. And that's really been...
It's a horrible game.
It's a horrible game.
This is dystopian.
It is.
We're already living in dystopia.
Yes.
But we are in the global north, luckily. So that's something.
Yes, I suppose. Although it's not totally clear to me that we really deserve our privileges here. But...
And also, we're not part of those 8 people that have got half of everything, are you?
Sadly not.
So, like, as you say, it's deep structural change. Like like when I was talking to Al Gore, who was absolutely lovely, and a lot of people have said talking at Al Gore very unfairly, in my view. Like that, my main point was, how can you have significant change within a context that is designed to prohibit real change? And once, when Yanis Varoufakis was here, he said that, you know, that Wolfgang Schauber said to him, democracy is okay as long as it don't change anything. So, as you are now saying, Jason, systemic change is what's required. Now, what are the so what I feel like that I want this podcast to do is marshal people's attention into the correct areas. Instead of going, oh, it would be ever so nice to have some micro banking, like your lovely students coming in on day one in their big lovely scarves and their rosy cheeks all full of optimism. Instead of that, saying, well, what is it? What ideas should we be pushing? What should we be campaigning for? Now, you've mentioned democracy at the level of global of institutions that govern global finance. That's one thing. Okay, we've remembered that. What else?
So, in order to really understand what's at stake here, I think that we have to understand how global inequality came to be as extreme as it is right now, right? So we need like some of the historical perspective there.
Okay,
so,
I'll handle this one. A lot of people are very, very lazy. Then there's countries, European countries, where we really were an industrious bunch and we cracked on and got a lot of things done. Now, is there an alternative version?
So the alternative version is that we might want to start with colonialism, right? Which, and if you want to look for sort of like the origins of mass poverty, it really is under colonialism, which was basically a process of mass displacement of peasants from the land and a total wreckage of local economies. So we know for a fact that during the colonial period, in most regions, income growth, real income growth per capita was about only 0.5% per year for the entire colonial period. Meanwhile, as a result of colonialism, rich countries like Britain got to grow at more than 3 times that much. And so that was a major driver of inequality. But here's the interesting point. I mean, if you want, we can go back to colonialism at some point. But in the wake of colonialism, in the 2 decades after colonialism ended in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a complete miracle in the global South. They suddenly had democracy and they had control over their own economic policies. And what did they do? They elected leftist progressive leaders, and they brought in tariff protections to protect their markets from cheap goods from abroad. They nationalized their own resources. They nationalized a lot of big companies and banks. They increased labor standards. They redistributed land from rich landowners to peasants. And with these policies, they were remarkably successful.
Were they? So what countries are these? Would you mind telling us, please?
I mean, it was all over the global South, but you can see it, I guess, most clearly, I suppose, in Latin America. I mean, look at what's happening in Chile and Brazil and Uruguay. You can also see it in parts of the Middle East, like Egypt. In East Asia, this is very clear as well.
So the global South, unshackled from colonialism, found its way towards policies like socialism, nationalism, redistribution of wealth, management of trade, and I suppose systems that were focused on people rather than profit broadly.
Exactly, yeah. And they were using their national wealth to invest in things like education and healthcare. And so, as you can imagine, poverty starts diminishing, and the gap between rich countries and poor countries starts closing for the first time in history. It was really a kind of miracle. And you would think that rich countries, since they always go on about wanting to develop poor countries, would be very excited about this trend, right? Finally, there's success and poverty is reducing. But quite the opposite. Actually, what we see is that rich nations feel that they're losing their access to cheap labor and cheap raw materials in the global South. And so, the access they'd enjoyed under colonialism. And so they start intervening violently by deposing a lot of these progressive leaders. So
I remember reading all about those leaders. They're a horrible bunch.
Yes.
So, I see. So globalization is just colonization by another name. Colonialization.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, but what's interesting is that the series of coups that started unfolding, led by Britain and the U.S. and France and Belgium.
What were we doing? We were funding coups to
we were either overthrowing leaders in the global South ourselves, or we were funding movements to overthrow them, or we were just supporting right-wing dictatorships to prevent democratic revolutions from happening.
God, we're so crafty, aren't we? We really love a bit of profit. We'll do whatever it takes. Go-getters, I say we are, us in the global north. So I suppose it's, wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. So in a very short period of time, post-colonially, economic disparity was decreased because people obviously acted in a kind of a national self-interest, not the sort of rampant individualism and inequality producing systems that we have grown to know and love. But all of these regions were pretty much successfully destabilized, and that movement was quashed, right?
Well, yeah, the movement was quashed, but it wasn't actually by the coups. So the coups took a really big toll, right? And the most famous of these is the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. And you can watch footage of it on YouTube, actually, bizarrely. But so even despite these interventions, the global south was still rising through the 70s, okay? But then, and the global north in the form of the G7 literally sat down around tables, leaders of the G7 sat down around tables to figure out how to stop this movement. The movement was called developmentalism, and it was very successful. And they couldn't figure out ways to sort of block this because it was becoming very powerful. In the halls of the UN, which was a democratic body, global south countries were winning new policies that were fairer for them, basically. But then in 1980, the tables turned dramatically in a single crazy event that changed the global order in one fell swoop. And that was the third world debt crisis. So basically, the U.S. Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates, to really high levels, like 20%. And global south countries were heavily indebted in U.S. dollars. They suddenly were not able to pay their debts back because of the interest rate hike, and they slid to the brink of default. Now, if they were going to default, Wall Street would have basically collapsed. And so Wall Street talked to the U.S. government and said, please, you need to bail us out. You need to solve this problem. The U.S. government talked to the IMF and said, you are going to go and roll over the debts of those developing countries on the condition that they adopt what we call structural adjustment programs, which basically means liberalize your trade, cut your labor rules, cut your environmental regulations, privatize your companies and your assets, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, this is what Naomi Klein talks about in Shock Doctrine, isn't it? That these sort of global policies led to the destabilisation of those regimes. Just one point I want to pick up on there, Jason. See that 20% hike by the Federal Reserve? Was that part of the scheme? How come they did that?
So that was not exactly part of the scheme, actually. That had to do with a domestic problem in the U.S. at the time. So the U.S. was suffering with what we call stagflation. Yeah, so
stagflation. Welcome to your doctor. Jason's missus is involved. Oh no, I can't show her. I'm embarrassed.
It was basically high levels of inflation but low levels of growth, and so they had to figure out some way to increase levels of growth again, because the rich people were really upset that they weren't gaining a fair income share. And so they figured out that they could, if they raised interest rates, it would basically cause a recession in the U.S. It would empty out the factories, break the back of the labor unions, which were very powerful at the time, and decrease the price of labor, which it succeeded in doing. And as a result, the cost of labor in the U.S. has not risen since 1980, if you can imagine it. So it was to solve a domestic political problem, but it had these ramifications around the world that changed the way the world worked.
Ultimately, to the benefit of the same interests, no? Because the Wall Street said to IMF, go roll over these loans. They said, we'll do it as long as you adopt these systems that are amenable to our worldview. And everyone's cushy, jobs are good. And you're very good at describing these things in a way that I can understand, because I understood that just then. Now, I'm angry about it. What are we going to do?
Yeah, I'm angry too. And a lot of, I would say most people in the world are angry.
Not as angry as me, mate. I'm fuming. I'm fuming about this. If you enjoyed that conversation, you can listen to all of it on Luminary. There's loads of content about that subject on this channel right now. And if you're going crazy because of this sort of stuff, please let me know how you're feeling in the comments. Let me know what you'd like to see more videos on. Please subscribe to my mailing list on at russellbrand.com as well. And if you need to meditate and chill out for a while, have a little look at this video. And if you'd like to see more content like this, watch this video. Most importantly of all, stay with us, stay connected, don't go crazy.